Blood on the Bayous is supported in part by Dr. B.B. Trotter from Abilene, Texas, and the Fort Butler Foundation. Thank you.
I'm Don Frazier, and we're continuing our discussion of the Civil War in Texas and Louisiana. When Southerners voted to secede in 1860 and 1861, they had hoped to achieve two major things. One, resist the election of Abraham Lincoln and their concomitant erosion of power in Washington, D.C., and secondly, to preserve slavery as a manifestation of states' rights. Slavery was a state prerogative, and they feared that the federal government would overreach its constitutional limits and try to rearrange state prerogatives. So, we want to preserve slavery, and we want to resist the Republicans and Lincoln in particular. Instead, their protest in the form of secession ends up making Abraham Lincoln a stronger president than he ever could have been had they stayed in the Union and merely been obstructionists in Congress. When they left, the opposition left with them, and Abraham Lincoln could now build a coalition government that had a very clear agenda. By doing that, by the Southerners doing what they did, they in fact doomed slavery. Paradoxically, in order to save the principle of states' rights, the reality of war and economic realities caused the Confederate States of America to become an aggressively centralized power that often ignored states' rights, while also trampling civil liberties. In essence, the Confederate government morphed into everything they hated about the federal government. What had been touted as a popular movement for Southern independence had ultimately resorted to the draconian tactics of impressment of goods and the conscription of men to support its claims of independence. Now, wars are driven by economies, and economies ultimately have a bedrock of gold because gold is worth gold, certainly in the 1860s. Gold was something the Confederacy was slightly short of, certainly in contrast to the Union. So with few gold reserves to back up its economy, they only had paper to try to float any sort of war. And this paper came in two forms: bonds and currency. Well, the bonds were supposed to be backed by cotton. So that's how you were going to back your bonds. Usually bonds were sold in exchange, sold by having people have confidence in your economy. The Confederacy can't really project confidence in its own economy. It's an unknown. But people understand the value of cotton. So perhaps bonds that are backed by cotton will be the answer. Well, that's fine and dandy if the people that own the bonds can ultimately put their hands on the cotton. They can't. And especially after the blockade and the fall of New Orleans. The Confederate cotton is now locked down within the Confederacy. So these bonds become largely useless. Understand that before the war, the South had accounted for 70% of U.S. exports. Now, they can't get anything through the blockade of any sort of consequence. So the idea that King Cotton would sway the world to be sympathetic to the Confederacy's move ends up becoming a complete illusion. Take a look at cotton as a commodity during the course of the war. About 6 million bales are produced during the course of the war. Well, turns out more of that southern cotton flows to northern factories and northern buyers than flows to European buyers or is used domestically by the Confederacy. So 500,000 bales end up in European hands. This is sold, that money is used to buy weapons of war, munitions, and these are smuggled back into the Confederacy theoretically. 500,000 more bales are consumed by the Confederates. They make uniforms, things like that, out of cotton. But 1 million bales head north. Well, what happens to the rest of the 6 million bales produced during the course of the war? 3.3 million bales are ordered to be destroyed. The Confederate government says, if the Federals look like they're going to capture your cotton, burn it. Well, that may explain why 1 million bales end up in northern hands. Because northern buyers are offering to buy cotton in gold. And because of the shortage of cotton created by this sort of king cotton strategy on the part of the Confederacy, price of cotton skyrocketed. And buyers are using gold to buy it. The temptation is to not burn your cotton, but to watch the Federals come up to your farm. You go out there, kiss the flag, and say, man, I'm glad you guys are here. I've always been a Union guy. Do you have any cotton buyers with you? Because I would sure like to trade. And that is going on across the South, especially going on in Louisiana. Well, what about the Southern economy in terms of buying and selling? I mean, what's the currency doing? Well, the Confederate government had resorted essentially just to printing money, not backed by anything. Now, bonds are backed by cotton that nobody can get their hands on, and the currency is backed by nothing. It's in fact fiat money. It's whatever. It's only worth what people say it's worth. Well, that leads to rampant inflation. Remember I said gold is worth gold. Well, what's a Confederate dollar trade versus gold? Well, in 1862, you could buy a Confederate dollar for 40 cents of gold. So it's already devalued by 60% by 1862. The following year, that same Confederate dollar would buy you 6 cents of gold. So it is completely collapsing. The currency is worth nothing. Another tactic that the Confederacy used in order to support its war effort was the impressment of people's goods and products. Your crops, they'd come in and take 10%. 10% of your cattle, 10% of your corn, 10% of your hogs. They were going to come in and take it. So who determines the value of the products that are being pressed by government agents? Let me show you an example of how this works. Let's say that flour is trading for $100 per 100 pound in Alexandria, Louisiana. So in essence, one Confederate dollar to purchase 1 pound of flour. Confederate agents will come in and take a look at that same 100 pound and say, nope, that's only worth $12 for taxation purposes. So we think that that's only worth 12 cents a pound. And you think it's worth $1 a pound. So what that means is the Confederacy comes in and essentially scrapes together more than $1,000 worth of flour and only gives you credit for having come in and taken 100. And so it's pretty soon people in the Confederate South are starting to resist the overreach of the Confederate government. What does this look like? Well, they hide their crops, they hide their slaves so that they're not pressed into Confederate fortification work or anything else, and they hide their sons from conscription officers. By 1863, the U.S. economy was roaring to its peak efficiency. The Union economy is booming. At the same exact time, the Confederate economy has not only peaked, but is now collapsing precipitously. If the Confederacy was ever to be independent, it would have to make good that claim in 1863. What had started 2 years before as a protest to the election of Abraham Lincoln, as a protest against abolitionism, as a protest against the loss of status and power in the National Compact, had now evolved into an engine of its own destruction. And the end was drawing ever closer.